Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. My name is Aviv Lubel, and I'm super excited to be kicking off day 5 of TMF week. So thank you, everyone, for joining. Today's first session is super exciting. It's making TMF changes personally, building accountability into your metrics program. And before I introduce today's distinguished speakers, I'm just going to go over a few general housekeeping rules. I feel like for those who've attended most, if not all of these sessions, this is kind of like the safety briefing on an airline flight. So at this point, you may want to check your laboratories for tamper-proof smoke detectors. My wife said that joke was going to bomb, and it probably did. In any case, so all the sessions are going to be recorded and are going to be made available at the end of the day. All the attendees are going to be receiving a certificate attendance, not just for this session, but for the entire TMF week conference. This is going to be an interactive session, so we highly encourage you to post your questions in the Q&A section of the engagement box right to the right of the presentation. We are going to be fielding your questions at the end of the presentation. And of course, each session is going to be followed by a networking break. So we encourage you guys to head to the lounge and network with some of your peers, and also check out Montrium's booth. So without further ado, I will introduce today's speakers. We have James Martin, Senior Director, TMF Operations and CDS. James has worked in a variety of roles across clinical development, operations management, process improvement, and for the past 5 years, trial master file and document management. Currently, James is heading up the TMF delivery arm within TMF operations at the CRO Syneos Health, where he gets to utilize his passion for continuous improvement using meaningful metrics and KPIs on a daily basis. We also have with us Crystal Gallagher, Director, Governance, TMF Operations. Crystal is experienced in governance and compliance and operational oversight. She currently oversees the governance division within Syneos Health TMF Operations, managing TMF analytics, compliance, and regulatory initiatives. So without any delay, I will hand it over to you guys to begin your presentation. Super excited.
Cool, thanks, Aviv. Can I just check that you can hear me before I get started?
Yep, we can hear you loud and clear.
Perfect. All right. So just we're waiting for the slides to come up.
Aviv, can you remove yourself from the green room? Just remove your slides. Perfect. Thank you.
How do I?
Oh,
slide should be removed.
The screen button at the bottom of the taskbar, there's a red button. Perfect. Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Cool. There we go. All right. So good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. It's a little disconcerting speaking to a screen versus a room full of people, but on the plus side, I can always assume that no one's asleep and that all of our content's riveting and all of our jokes are funny. So there's an upside to it too. So on the whole, what we're going to go through today is sort of a holistic discussion around TMF metrics, and then moving more specifically into how we're looking at making some TMF metrics more personal and tying them specifically into performance management. So this is the high-level agenda. We're going to start off with our sort of overall approach to discussing TMF metrics at Syneos Health. We're going to ask a survey question on Menti, which is an interactive question. So we'll be able to see how many of you actually are awake. Hopefully it's most. Then looking at a perspective that we have taken on overall TMF oversight in terms of different ways of looking at TMF metrics, how those can feed into performance management and building a culture of accountability, some additional considerations, and then a summary of key takeaways. And we'll have a brief period of time at the end where we will take any questions. So if you have any questions as you go through, then please feel free to put them into the Q&A box on the right of your screen. All right, so a quick introduction to the way that we have started looking at TMF metrics more recently at Syneos. At the end of the day, a TMF is really just a database. As a a collection of metadata, different documents, and a great deal of information in terms of when documents are collected, potential queries with documents, how long it's taking documents to get into a TMF, and there's just a wide plethora of different data points that can form metrics. And when we first started coming together and discussing this, it was a few years ago. There really is, because it is just a database, there really is a lot that you can measure. And we really wanted to try and think about a way of focusing on the data points that are most relevant. So the approach that we took about, going about that was to think of a questions first sort of methodology. So I was trying to think about ignoring the data points for the time being and focusing specifically on what questions we wanted to answer. What questions were we getting from being that we're in TMF operations? What questions are we getting from our study teams? What questions are we getting from our clients? What questions are we getting from our leadership and executives? And then once we had a sort of a good summary of what those sort of questions would be, then we could go about figuring out what metrics and what data points would best answer those questions. So it's a sort of questions first, data later approach to looking at metrics, and specifically around TMF. So with that, I'm going to pass over to Crystal, who's going to kick us off with the Mentee survey.
Thanks, James. This is, as we get started, we wanted to talk a bit about the questions first approach and take a moment to have our audience share with us some questions or thoughts about their TMF. So if you don't mind going to mentee.com, as you can see on the screen, there is a code that you can enter where you can provide questions that you first think about in regards to have you either have or face in regards to your TMF health. And we'll give everyone a couple minutes to populate some questions that they typically ask about TMF. And then we'll take a look at those collected results. So again, if you can either snap the QR code with your camera on your phone, or go to mentee.com and enter the code 88430176.
And this is actually the first time we've attempted this, and generally anything that's sort of technologically complex has a habit of going wrong. So we're keeping our fingers crossed that this is going to work out all right. Yeah, in terms of the questions, I can see from the attendees, we have quite a wide variety of different attendees, from some TMF specialists, CRAs, managers, project managers, directors. So it's sort of what we want to understand is what questions either would you have specifically around the health of a TMF or the status of a TMF, or what questions do you receive on a day-to-day basis, or what questions do you have to answer?
This is great. We can see the questions coming in live here. Not much to our surprise. We see some of a common trend. But we'll give everyone just a couple more minutes to enter in any other questions that they think about when they think generally about TMF health. All right, I think this is the last chance to enter in anything else that you want to on the screen. And while we wait to let you know, James is going to chat with us now a little bit about how we have some of the similar types of questions in our own organization, Syneos Health, and how we face them when dealing with our TMF. Oh, look, we have a lot more questions coming in. That's great. We have inspection readiness. Okay.
Actually, can we go back a slide, Crystal? And we can, I don't know if we can still.
Yep.
Yeah, all right. I need to make it a little bit bigger on my screen. Okay, so we've got like benchmarking timeliness as a metric. How quality is measured, inspection readiness. So at the end of the day, like, and I appreciate you responding to that question, but at the end of the day, we have, both Crystal and I have worked within TMF operations for a good amount of time. I think probably around 4 to 5 years just within our present organization. And if you go to the next slide, Crystal. Generally, the sort of, if we were to bucket the different questions that we receive, we've performed a sort of similar analysis within our present organization. And generally, the top 3 questions around TMF health will tend to fall into one of 3 areas. So that's around inspection readiness. That is like looking at quality, completeness, timeliness. So it's more of a sort of holistic, how ready is this TMF to be inspected or audited. It's then also questions around, well, what's outstanding? What queries do we have? What actions need to be taken in order to make sure that the TMF is inspection ready? And then the other is, well, like, how am I performing, or how am my team performing? So whether that's as an individual team member, or whether it is as a document QC reviewer, or a project manager, or a line manager. Those are generally the sort of, at a high level, the 3 buckets that those questions tend to fall into. And obviously there's minutiae within that. But the way that we have, the approach that we take to looking at that is to take what we call a AAA perspective. And to me, like, a AAA in the UK is generally something that's seen as like trustworthy if it's like, you know, like a financial product or a company that is, you would be happy to like lend money to, as something that's sort of seen as a very positive thing. I think Crystal said that AAA in the US means something to do with broken down cars. So maybe that's like a less good analogy over there, or maybe it's more accurate, I don't know. But generally, so to answer those 3 questions, we can look at the TMF through 3 different lenses. So the image on the right, it might look like a Venn diagram, but ultimately the intent was that each one of those circles represents like a lens or a sort of a perspective with which to look into the TMF. So how inspection ready is my TMF is a lens that we'll be looking through, will be sort of an aggregate. So it's pulling together all the data that we have, rolling it up to the top level and seeing like what's a bird's eye view, like how does all that data aggregate? What does that tell us about the TMF? We have the actionable, which is all of this, sort of the outstanding tasks that need to be completed, and then attributable. And that's kind of ultimately where this presentation is going, is once we have all this data, either specifically around one TMF or across a portfolio, it's like how do we then tie that back to individual contributors within that process? So whether that's a document owner, whether that is a system admin, whether it's a CRA, a project manager, all that data that we have within the TMF database, how do we tie that back to individual users and then use that to drive change? So I think I'm going to hand back to, actually, no, one more slide, Crystal. So this is, just before we move into some of the more specifics, we wanted to present like a high level eTMF process. So this isn't going to be something that is new to anyone particularly, but we just wanted to present this so it puts in context the future discussions that we have and some of the assumptions that we have. Because ultimately there are going to be a lot of different models of TMF process, whether electronic, whether paper, whether in-house, whether outsourced, whether split across multiple vendors, whether there are decentralized teams involved in terms of the submission and document QC. So just to sort of help simplify things and at the most generic level, our process assumes that all of the activities take place within an eTMF system. And that includes document creation, collection, submission. That then moves on to a second step of quality review, which is looking at the quality of the documents. And then a completeness review, which is looking at how complete the TMF is. And some of the different actors within that process will be a document owner. It's typically someone on a project team. that would be generating or collecting content. A document QC reviewer, so it should be more of like a TMF specialist, someone that is not considered part of the project team, but will perform some quality check review of the documents and provide feedback and queries. And then the completeness process, which would either be the document owner performing a completeness review, or it could be a similar model with the document QC reviewer, where an independent centralized team will be performing a completeness review, or even that in some cases the system's able to automate and provide output based on expected content. And the two sort of feedback loops that we measure through quality and completeness will be through queries and placeholders. Again, this is intended to be a very generic process, but this is just to help tee us off into some of the future discussions. So Crystal, I'll hand back to you.
Sure. When we talk about the AAA approach, the first set of metrics that we were focused on are aggregate metrics. These are probably the most traditional metrics you're used to and tend to have a study level focus. They're scheduled metrics. They're critical to the overall TMF health assessment. They provide visibility into inspection readiness, and they're often tied to bonus malus types of structures for studies and tend to be also the industry standard. So the aggregate metrics that James mentioned are typically answer questions for us, such as how inspection ready is my TMF. So we look at the questions such as, are all documents present in our TMF? And are all the documents filed in the TMF on time? Or how quality are the documents when they're initially filed in the TMF? And as you might expect, the company metrics for these look at completeness across the entire study. And depending on how your TMF is structured or how your measurement looks, it's something like how many final documents are present compared to the expected documents at a particular point in time, either cumulative or after a certain type of milestone or event is achieved. And when we talk about timeliness, we are calculating how a percent of how on time are my documents. So how many documents have been submitted to the TMF on time compared to the whole of documents submitted within whatever time frame that you're providing that assessment. And then lastly, for quality, we're looking at, for any, again, particular point in time across the study, how many documents met the initial quality review that were reviewed by quality reviewer out of the total number of documents that were reviewed, providing you a quality metric. And then next we look at that second A in the AAA approach, the actionable data. And actionable is an area where you can see study level focus, again, measured at a point in time or ad hoc, but they provide more visibility into the pending actions, which tend to be inspection readiness roadblocks and really help you identify areas of risk for your TMF. So that overall question we were looking at in the AAA approach is what actions are outstanding to ensure inspection readiness. So it looks like what queries are overdue, or how many completeness reviews are outstanding, and what missing documents being filed in the TMF. Are the missing documents being filed, or system tickets being resolved? And when you look at the associated metrics with questions like that, you can get something such as the percent of overdue completeness reviews or outstanding queries, the overdue placeholders percent, or the percent of aged tickets if you're looking at it from a perspective of the system. How many aged outstanding tickets do you have? So those are the two primary A's within the AAA approach, and they're all very critical to the overall health of the TMF and part of those standards. But of course, as we discussed when we introduced our approach, they're more impactful when they're accompanied by the attributable TMF metrics. And that's what James will go into more detail, is bringing in that third arm for this.
Thanks, Crystal. So attributable, I think what Crystal's just run through is generally, I'd be surprised if there wasn't a sort of an organization that wasn't looking at the TMF through those two lenses. So the attributable is kind of what we see as like the evolution. So it's trying to get to the root cause for why a TMF might not be inspection ready. And there are going to be multiple root causes, but at the end of the day, the users and like the owners of the content and the people involved in the process are one of the largest for sure going to be one of the largest drivers of success when it comes to inspection readiness. So when it comes to making that attributable, it's really, we can pin that back to anyone that's involved within the process. We can also, it's less about perhaps looking at a TMF in isolation. Again, from like a CRO perspective, we may have team members that are working across multiple TMFs. So it's about looking at that, the performance of that individual across the, like holistically across all of the studies that they may touch. And that can also obviously apply for a sponsor who may be running multiple studies within a particular program, or have the same team members or study managers perhaps involved in multiple studies. So it's, as I say, it's more holistically looking at the health of the TMF, but within the context of the individual users within that process. So to go through a couple of examples, if you click once more, Crystal. So a question that we fairly frequently get, either from CRAs or from CRA line managers, project managers, is like, well, how are my CRAs performing? They're ultimately responsible for generating a significant portion of the content of the TMF. So how are they performing in terms of the documents that they're submitting? So the sort of questions we're getting is, well, like how on time or how quickly after a site visit are documents being submitted? What sort of quality of the documents that are being submitted? Who within my team do we need to focus on in terms of managing the performance, in terms of like targeting retraining, who might be having challenges, who isn't, say, following the guidelines set out by our SOPs in terms of the types of documents they're submitting, the timeliness of them, and the completeness reviews, for example. So this is sort of an example of different metrics that we can look at as an individual based upon thinking of it through a questions first approach. So as an example for the CRA, I think if we go to the next slide, this is more focused perhaps around the second, like a different part of the process. I think for a CRA, the questions that you might get for a CRA would be very similar to other members of the study team. But this would be perhaps as a document reviewer, like, or a line manager or someone that oversees document reviewers. So the sort of questions that you might have is, well, okay, well, how efficiently am my team reviewing documents? And there are different ways that you might be able to look at that, or metrics that would feed into that. So how many documents per hour are they reviewing, or how long on average is being spent on each individual document? What is the accuracy of the quality review? And so about looking at building a process around that, perhaps through a sampling process. So the intent of this presentation isn't to sort of give a sort of black and white guideline of what metrics to look at. It's more around like stimulating discussion and thought around what sort of things would be interesting, what sort of questions do we get, and what sort of ways could we go about answering that to ensure that we're maximizing the performance of the team members involved. I think once you thought about the questions that we get asked, and specifically around performance, then we can start building goals around those, and through those goals, linking them directly into whatever performance management process you have, and with the end result of ultimately driving improved accountability and improved performance for the eTMF. And I think, bear in mind what I said about the ultimate like driver of TMF health is the team members involved in terms of submitting or reviewing the documentation for each individual study. So if you can help to address and support them at that upstream point, then you're almost guaranteeing yourself success downstream when it comes to inspection readiness. So one way that we are proposing to do that is through establishing SMART goals and putting them into our performance management process within our organization. So it'll be part of annual appraisals, although not to say it'll be reviewed only annually, but there'll be like a part of an annual appraisal that is related to that individual team member's contribution to the TMFs for their study. We all know, I'm sure we've heard in other presentations, that TMF is ultimately the final deliverable of any study. And it's also one of those things that is quite easy not to prioritize or give particular focus to. There are always other activities that are more sort of more exciting, or have more interest, or just generally pull focus away from just filing documents in the TMF. So we're trying to think about a way that we can help to ensure that focus is maintained. So within our organization's performance management process, we have to set SMART goals for our teams each year. Actually going through that process, I think, at the moment. And as I say, what we're proposing to do is for different team members involved, whether that's in the project team side or whether that's in the document specialist team side, but building SMART goals specifically around TMF performance. And in order to drive and be able to demonstrate change. So I wanted to go through one example here of, this is based upon an exercise from a legacy company, and this was about using a SMART goal to improve performance for the CRA finalization of monitoring visit reports. So per the process, monitoring visit reports should have been completed within 10 business days. And there was sort of, as you can see from the top graph, this is a representation of the data, but the average was significantly above that. And once that goal was actually established and built into performance management, meaning that the individual team members started to hold themselves to a higher level of accountability for achieving that goal, what we actually saw was a significant improvement. So after only 3 months, like the average dropped by around 4 days. The number of reports that were finalized in less than 10 days almost doubled. So it's just I wanted to bring this up as a demonstration of the effectiveness of setting SMART goals and actually tying them into performance management. But the one thing that some of you may have already noticed is that there needs to be some consideration in terms of potential unintended consequences of setting goals like this. And an example here is that you can see from the top that the number of reports that are finalized in greater than 30 days was 8, but the number of reports that were finalized in greater than 30 days after the implementation of the goal was actually 13. And that's because the unintended consequence of establishing this goal was that if a visit report was 11 days old, it was already not going to be something that would be counted to be finalized within the goal. So if you had a report that was, say, 8 days old and one that was 11 days old as a CRA, then you're now incentivized to focus on the report that was only 8 days old in order to get it completed within 10 days. So overall, the improvement was significant, but it's just, I wanted to use this as an example that there can be some unintended consequences, because ultimately the number of reports greater than 30 days actually increased slightly, even though the overall average and those less than 10 days significantly improved. As I say, I just think this is a good example for any organization that's looking to implement SMART goals for specifically around anything to do with TMF, but just to also consider not just the intended outcome, but potential unintended outcomes. And then you can consider how best to mitigate those. So Crystal's going to go through a couple of examples for CRAs and document QC reviewers.
Yeah, thanks, James. And on the screen here, you can see a couple of examples like James mentioned. So for a document owner or CRA, for example, you put the goal of submitting 90% of your applicable documents within 30 days of the finalization or receipt. So that timeliness calculation, keeping in mind the example previously, those unintended consequences of performing not to that threshold once you know you've missed it for those other documents or whatever it is you're measuring. And for our second example, we have 90% of documents to be submitted that meet the quality standard upon initial submission to the TMF. And then for a document QC reviewer, we have 2 examples of the quality review of the TMF documents, 90% of them within 7 calendar days. And upon a quality sampling of their performance of reviewing documents, ensuring 95% standards. So when you're quality sampling, that 95% of the documents sampled for their work met the quality standard. So in practice, we wanted to give you a quick rundown of these examples that we're talking, just to kind of bring it back full circle. So in this example, Charlie, the CRA, submitted 140 of 150 documents within 30 days. And then Jessica, the document QC reviewer, reviewed 2,250 documents, where 2,005 of them were within 7 calendar days. And you can see in the next two that the Charlie, the CRA, submitted 120 of 140 documents that met the quality standard. And then through random sampling of Jessica's QC review work, 98% of the documents achieved that quality standard. And when you bring calculations in, you can see that Charlie met that threshold of timeliness at 93% for an attributable metric for her performance specifically. That Jessica had an 89% quality review timeliness, and that Charlie, that CRA, had an 86% quality rate personally for the documents that were submitted, and 98% quality sampling for Jessica. And I think that brings us into the last pieces of considerations that James is going to talk a bit more about.
Yeah, thanks, Crystal. So we've sort of given a bit of an overview of what we're proposing in terms of helping to drive process improvement by holding individual team members to a high level of account. But there are some sort of additional considerations that we wanted to run through. So the first is that we're still operating in a wide variety of different TMF models, and this approach to directly building into performance management will need to take some of that into account. What I mean by that is, perhaps from a CRO perspective, that would mean that you could have team members operating in a number of different client systems where data availability may be varied, or even access to data. From a client perspective or from a sponsor perspective, you may also be operating in multiple different TMF models through acquisitions of different other companies. And again, like data availability to be able to provide a robust picture of performance could also potentially be a challenge. That doesn't necessarily mean it's insurmountable, but just that it's worth being something to consider at least. The tools, resources, and administrative burden. Most of the systems that I think we have today aren't fully capable to be able to provide, I think, the visualizations based upon, or like the way that we're looking at user information. You can look at it by user, but in terms of rolling it up and taking into account some of the different data points and collating that based around, say, Charlie, the CRA, what we're finding we have to do is to visualize that within tools that sit alongside some of those systems. So Power BI or a Spotfire, some sort of like a data visualization tool. So an additional consideration will be availability of those tools to you. And in terms of administrative burden, because again, depending upon team size and depending upon how the sort of the scale that you may wish to roll this out, there's also some aspect of administrative burden. I think we have within our organization, we have, I think, probably like close to 1 FTE that is supporting across multiple different aspects, but in order to be able to collect and provide the data on an ongoing basis. And the ongoing basis is also a part of it, is that if we're building this into a performance management process, and especially linking it into an annual appraisal, that does not necessarily mean that we would only be looking to look at the metrics on an annual basis. What we propose is that it's something on a much more frequent basis, so that as a project team member, as a CRA, or as a line manager, you have ongoing transparency into the performance either of yourself or of your team, which means that you have a better opportunity to course correct, to understand where there may be training issues or maybe other factors that are driving non-compliance, but also to give team members the opportunity to, as I say, to course correct, so that for the year overview is more of a summation of multiple data points as opposed to just one snapshot at the end of the year. And the other is that based upon some countries and GDPR, there are also some restrictions around the way that data can be visualized and who that data can be made available to. So in terms of whether employee name can be used, and also if you're going to create a database or dashboard, you may also need to consider the access to, or access restrictions around who's able to see the information within it. So the approach that we're taking is looking at how we can lock it down to provide visibility only to a line manager. So if a line manager will log into the system, they'll see the data for their team, but won't be able to see it for any other team members. And that is sort of, as I say, considering the constraint of GDPR on personal data. So those are some of the additional considerations. And in terms of key takeaways, so our top 3 key takeaways, as we started the presentations, questions first. So that is thinking about what questions you're getting, what questions you have, and then tying the metrics back to those questions. Thinking of AAA. So I think if you ever see Chris Laura at a conference, then even if you think broken down car, like whatever sticks in your mind, then I hope that's one of the takeaways in terms of the different lenses and perspectives with which to look at TMF health, and then using those perspectives to build into a culture of accountability. The TMF is not necessarily the most exciting or interesting, but it is one of the most important deliverables of a clinical trial. And in order to make sure that we're delivering it to the best of our ability, we need to focus on how we can build it directly into the culture of our organizations. And one of the best ways of doing that, as you can see from the example of monitoring visit reports, is to directly build it into some sort of performance management or appraisal process. So I think that might be the last slide. Yep. Okay. So with that, I guess, Aviv, do we hand back to you? Are you able to help us field a few questions? Or maybe Kimberly?
Q&A section. So one of the questions we have is, do performing TMF review activities prior to on-site monitoring visits help the study team to keep the TMF updated? Who should be considered the main point of contact to complete or filing of missing documents at country level and trial level?
So I think that the question sort of, there are multiple different ways to answer it based upon the setup of your organization. So I think the first part was performing a review prior to a site visit. Is that right?
Yeah, it's prior to on-site monitoring visits, exactly.
Yep, okay. So again, it really depends upon the setup of your organization. I think most organizations will have some definition of what they consider to be a timely document submission in terms of how long a document should take to be submitted to TMF. Typically, that time is shorter than the time between site visits. So ideally, any QC or review of the TMF should be, I think, performed on an ongoing basis as much as possible. So the model that we implement, we have centralized teams that are independent of the project teams and CRAs. So the CRA will perform a visit. I think that multiple different systems can support this, but we use system data to help generate expected content. So perhaps if you have like a site visit date, then that can auto-populate various expectations for TMF content. When documents are submitted, they'll automatically enter into a workflow where an independent quality reviewer can look at the quality of documents. So that should mean that for the vast majority of CRAs, by the time they come to go to the site the next time, they'll have already received feedback on the quality of the documents from the previous visit, and should be also prepared with a list of expected but missing content. So when they go to review the site file, they're able to sort of shortlist the documents that are required to be collected. But as I say, it's a great question, but it's just there are so many different ways of answering it based upon an organization structure.
Okay, well, thank you for that. Crystal, anything you'd want to add to that?
No, I agree with him, with James.
So one of the main things of your presentation today was accountability. And Sandra asks, how do you hold the CRO partner accountable to the SMART goal?
So, and again, I mean, there are multiple different ways of doing that, but I think based upon my personal attendance at some of these conferences recently, I think it's about first, at the very study outset, it would be about defining what those goals are and getting agreement with the CRO in terms of what is a reasonable expectation, ensuring that data is available from your system or theirs in terms of being able to provide visibility into whether those targets are being met. And what we're seeing on a sort of increasing basis is that some of our clients are actually building some of those KPIs into contracts, meaning that there are sort of bonus malus clauses tied in. I mean, there's definitely complexity around doing that, and that there are different sort of other factors that need to be taken into account. But in terms of accountability, I think in the same way that we would performance manage like individual team members through establishing SMART goals and getting buy-in, I think it would be a pretty similar sort of approach in order to being able to hold a partner to account.
Yeah, and I would second that. I think part of the desire to bring in the attributable individual metrics is what feeds into the quality of those aggregate metrics. And I think that's part of that intention, is to make sure that when you can identify through those individual channels where the metrics are suffering, that will help feed into those overall metrics that we already look at across the study. And the second thing that I would say is, it's probably as you set those targets, is to really understand that you're adding in metrics and thresholds that are truly understood by both parties, will help make sure that you're accountable, because you set the expectations on both sides.
Perfect.
I think that I've just had sort of a further second to digest it. I think it's something that I would ensure that was clearly defined in the TMF plan up front, that both teams are bought into it. And probably most importantly is that there's a cadence set up for reporting and evaluating those metrics. I think, again, we support multiple hundreds of studies, and even with the best of intentions, a lot of metrics are established at the beginning and documented. But without this sort of cadence and ongoing review of those metrics, then they don't mean anything. So if you're looking to help build accountability, then I think the key to it is probably to establish cadence in terms of reviewing those metrics.
Great. Well, thank you. Kimberly, I'll defer to you. Do we have time for one more question? You're on mute, Kimberly.
It would not be a conference if somebody did not say you're on mute, Kimberly. I just wanted to, we have like about 2 minutes for like one last question.
Okay.
Because yeah, we're getting to time right now.
Okay, so if you guys can answer this in just a few moments, I want to get this question out. But how do you manage the challenges during the initial build and ongoing updates for expected documents and the actual that should be accounted for and reflected correctly, the actual documents, that is? I am seeing false 100% completion rates in the metrics. That's a loaded question with very little time to answer.
Again, I think there are multiple different ways of approaching it. I mean, in terms of the 100% complete, is that it's going to depend on the way that completeness is measured, whether it's at the document type level, whether it's at the milestone level, whether you're using like system data to actually drive the expectation, and what investment you had at the beginning of the study to establish expected document lists. So what I mean is, like, for a particular event to occur, what types of documents are expected. I think you need to invest time up front in order to be able to have a clear understanding of what would be expected at different events, and then have a timely review of those milestones and events as they complete throughout the study.
Excellent, thank you. Crystal?
Yep, I would second that, and I would say, with shifting resources if needed to really refine the expected documents has been one of the things that we have really worked to focus on, to make sure that that's as accurate as possible, because of similar challenges, of course, across the board.
Okay, well, guys, we are coming up on time. Thank you so much. That was an absolutely awesome session. Great information, great insight. We really, really appreciate it. I want to remind our viewers that the next session is coming up at 10 a.m. in about 15 minutes. And what would I find in your TMF? Top 10 problems and best practices and how to avoid them. And that's going to be delivered by Daniel Bennett at Shinongi, if I pronounced that properly, which I probably did not. And in the meantime, obviously, after every session, we have a networking break. So I encourage everyone to head over to the lounge or the monitoring booth. Gives you a great opportunity to chat with your peers on a whole range of really exciting topics. You can meet new people. Essentially, chill. If you're in Europe, it's happy hour, and have a good time. And we'll see you guys at the lounge.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks.